Can you tell me more about the days prior to the invasion? Any calls you've had with President Putin, any calls you've had with Zelensky? How were those discussions like? Anything you can share because now it's been 4 years.
You know, Mario, there were many details. And off the cuff, it's hard for me to even remember all these details. I just want to focus on very important details. Some moments. Now, all of us, and especially you, representatives of the media, are immersed in the search for reasons. Look for who is to blame for starting this conflict. My understanding comes from other positions. We will find out who is to blame later. No one will escape responsibility. We will discuss in detail and understand the reasons for this. This is not the main issue on the agenda today. And here I would like to once again emphasize the position of the current administration of the United States. It is only thanks to this administration that the issue of ending the war has become so urgent. But I spoke about this back when the negotiations were taking place here. The Minsk agreements were signed. After all this, I said that we would not be able to achieve any peace. Even before the war started, at that time it was about the conflict that started in 2014 in Donbass. I said back then that this issue cannot be resolved without the United States of America. Everything will depend on the position that the United States and its closest allies take. But look, that's what happened. Would the conflict in Ukraine flare up if the US, England, and other Western countries had not supported this war by supplying weapons to Ukraine? This conflict would not have happened. While someone needed this war. And only with Donald Trump coming to power, the question of ending the war was put bluntly. And he said directly what he could do and what would happen if the war doesn't stop. He said it correctly. You know this. That is why this is the main thing today, and not to search for the guilty. Well, let's keep looking for the guilty for another 2 years until another million of people on both sides die. Do we need this? No, we need to stop the conflict. We need to make sure that they stop shooting at the first stage. They should stop shooting at each other. After all, it is brothers who shoot at each other. These people are brothers. The Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. Today in Russia, more than 1 million, or even significantly more than that, perhaps 5 million Ukrainians are living. There are mixed marriages. Well, there are not many Russians left in Ukraine because they were simply expelled from there. But there are still quite a lot of them. But they are the same. We are monitoring the situation at the front, and we hear the Russians and Ukrainians saying, "We are fighting well." They are fighting well. Why? Because we graduated from the same military academies. This is how the military think on one side and on the other. They understand that they came from the same cradle, and it so happened that they are fighting against each other today. So this needs to be stopped. And here we are on the same page with the Americans. We must do everything for this. What was going on then? Recently, I noticed something. I will turn to Trump again. He reproached Vladimir Zelensky for having 3 years to stop the war. He asked, "Why didn't you do it?" Very well said. These 3 years. From the beginning, it was necessary to stop this war. When the conflict began, literally a few weeks later, I think, here in Belarus, there was the first round of negotiations. I was very keen to get these negotiations started, and I suggested having them in Belarus. The Ukrainians and Russians met in Gomel. Then they didn't like something, changed their mind and said they wanted to meet in the West. In Belovezhskaya Pushcha, 2 rounds took place there. We did everything for them to sit down at the negotiating table. Then the Ukrainians probably didn't like Belarus at all, and they went to Istanbul. It was their last meeting. And there was a certain result, which Putin often mentions. There was a corresponding document. It was much more advantageous than the situation now. Back then, I publicly kept pushing the Ukrainian leadership to the fact that it was necessary to make peace. It was necessary to agree. They said, no, we will fight until the last Ukrainian. And the West pushed Ukraine towards this. Well, so they are fighting until the last Ukrainian. Several million people fled Ukraine. And in America, you claim that about 1 million are dead or injured on the Ukrainian side. So, well, there is nothing good in this. But in the first days of this war, I called Zelensky. I won't talk about the circumstances. I called him and told him the following. He spoke for a long time explaining why the war began. Moreover, by then he believed Belarus to be an aggressor together with Russia. He was screaming and shouting. I listened to him and then asked him a question in a friendly manner. Volodya, tell me, please, in what land is the war taking place? On what territory? It is in your Ukraine. Therefore, as president, you will be responsible for this. You are responsible for not preventing the war and for the fact it is taking place on the territory of Ukraine. The second thing I told him was, who is to blame? I often give this example. I said, before that, let's not talk about Donbass. In Odessa, the nationalist forces of Ukraine burned several dozen people alive in the House of Trade Unions. They were Russians, Russian-speaking people. They have always lived in Ukraine. Why did they burn these people alive? All this kept being ramped up. The Russian language was suppressed. Russian-speaking people, and there were millions of them in the West, were facing oppression. Ukraine started to oppress them. And I asked the question, imagine if in Mexico, in the north of Mexico, let's say, the Mexicans treated the citizens of the United States of America in a similar way. What would happen? Any U.S. administration, at the demand of the U.S. public, would sweep Mexico from the face of the earth into the Gulf or America, or the Gulf of Mexico. Right? Well, the public started to demand from Putin to defend Russian-speaking people in Ukraine who were being offended by the authorities. There are many other reasons Putin defended them. So what claims can you make against him? I say there were other reasons for this. The Russian authorities talk about them. Security guarantees for Russia from NATO in the USA. He publicly asked for guarantees. No such guarantees were given. So the situation developed in such a way that the West, to some extent, especially Western European countries, pushed the leadership of Ukraine towards this war. As for reasons, there will always be one. A reason was found. But the main thing, Musk is right to start this audit of the spending of U.S. funds. USAID was closed and so on. What were they doing? They funded coups in countries. More than $5 billion, and that what is known so far was sent to Ukraine in order to carry out the Maidan. For what? We experienced the same thing in 2020. The unrest in Belarus was financed from these sources. That's how it happened. That's why initially we took a friendly position in this conflict. I am often asked if I knew that this war would start in February 3 years ago. No, I didn't know. But if I had known, I would not have defended Ukraine then, because at that moment, we were already at war with Ukraine. Belarus and Ukraine, an economic war. Economic war. Ukraine imposed sanctions against us earlier than the Americans in Western Europe. The border was closed. They seized thousands of our railway freight cars with goods. They still haven't returned them, and about 1,000 heavy-duty trucks. They arrested 75 of our citizens, drivers who worked on these vehicles. And I had to carry out a special operation in order to get them out of there. They killed 3 of them and mutilated their bodies so that we would not understand how it happened. So why should I have defended Ukraine? That is, Ukraine escalated relations with Belarus earlier than the Americans and the entire West. So there is nothing to blame us for. But nevertheless, we spoke out against the war. We wanted peace. That was our position. And I emphasize once again, in the first days of the war, I called Zelensky and told him all this. The third thing I told him was, a new administration will come to power in the United States and policy will change. Nobody will support you in the war. And that's what happened. Everything was predicted, not because I am a great foreteller, but everything I said and everything was in the media. There is a corresponding recording. All of this happened. Here are some small details. If we talk about the reasons, about who is to blame, these are just a few points. When the time comes, we will discuss this. But today, we have to stop the war.
There's talking about the causes of the war, which I want to move on. There's one quote that President Putin said in 2017. I want to get your thoughts on it. He said, I have met with 3 US presidents. They all had their own ideas, but the decisions were made by men in dark suits. Have you had a discussion with President Putin about this concept? And you've kind of alluded to those people that pressured Ukraine to start the war and pushed Ukraine for the war. Who makes those decisions from your experience?
No, that's how it was. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. The man is not in office anymore. But this was done publicly. In Istanbul, when the process of concluding peace agreements was moving forward, the then Prime Minister of England arrived there, Boris Johnson. Johnson, it was public. He forbade Zelensky to pursue peace. He pushed Zelensky once again towards war. Why am I saying this? I know very well how this backstage machinations work in the West. Johnson would have never done this on his own without being pushed by the then U.S. administration. Therefore, I am absolutely convinced that Great Britain and the Biden administration were involved in the next round of escalation in Ukraine. I am absolutely convinced of this. This was a coordinated position of the Americans and the British, which Johnson expressed when he came there.